Joy and warm feelings are not enjoyed in every household. For some, it could be a dark place filled with cruelty and suffering. Here are some of the worst cases of domestic violence ever. They're sad, but true. Number 8. Maria Escamilla. One night in March 2011, a 46-year-old Maria Escamilla got violently assaulted by her boyfriend Jose Arreola at her home in Lancaster, Texas. Maria was attacked with a lamp and was then stabbed repeatedly in the face, breasts, and genitalia. During the assault, which lasted for 5 hours, Arreola also raped and sodomized his girlfriend before leaving her to die. The injuries Maria sustained were terrible. When she was brought to the hospital, her eyes were swollen shut and her face badly bruised all over. Over 500 stitches were required for the numerous slash and stab wounds, and one of her lungs had been punctured. She also suffered multiple bone fractures and had to undergo numerous surgeries to insert metal plates in her face, as well as plastic surgery to get rid of protruding bones. Her left eye was also damaged in the assault, and she permanently lost full use of her right hand. Arreola was brought to trial, and although spared a life sentence, received 28 years in jail instead. The jury even awarded Maria $40 million in damages, the highest payout ever awarded to a domestic abuse victim in U.S. history. However, Maria doubts she'll ever receive a penny as her ex-boyfriend has little money. She has since become a speaker against domestic violence and has traveled the world to share her story. Number 7. Lisa Holden. For 7 years, Lisa Holden from Texas suffered severe domestic abuse from her husband, Josh. The mother of 3 was often beaten with electrical wires and jumper cables, a baseball bat, as well as a knife and pellet gun on one occasion. In March 2012, the then 27-year-old Lisa had had enough. That day, her husband had beaten her severely in the morning because he was angry that she wasn't getting their children ready for school fast enough. As he went out to take their 7-year-old to school, he threatened to kill her upon his return. Lisa decided not to stay. She took her 2 younger children, aged 2 and 3, and fled with them to the woods. There she hid for 2 days with her children before being found on the roadside by a passerby. She was in terrible shape, with broken legs and head injuries, and had been drifting in and out of consciousness while trying to stop passing cars for help. Her husband was arrested, but released with a $100,000 bail. A few days later, he was back in jail on 2 additional assault charges. Lisa was in critical condition for 10 days at the hospital, and doctors even found metal pellets in her legs from a previous attack when her husband shot her with a pellet gun. Their children were taken to a foster home. Number 6. Suzanne Thomas. Suzanne Thomas had first met Jason McClain in a nightclub in March 2013. They almost instantly hit it off, and half a year later, McClain moved into Suzanne's home in Nottingham, but he quickly became controlling and jealous, and the two fought often. After just a few weeks of living together, Suzanne dumped McClain and threw him out. One day, Suzanne returned home to find her ex-boyfriend waiting with a knife in hand. He forced her and himself inside, while a friend who had been accompanying Suzanne managed to run away to get help. Once inside, McClain proceeded to kick Suzanne repeatedly and stamped her on the head while she begged him to stop. He then went on to pour boiling hot water from a kettle directly onto Suzanne's lap, down her legs and stomach, causing her to scream in pain. Afterwards, he went back to the kitchen to refill the kettle, but the police had arrived by then. Suzanne was rushed to the hospital, while her abuser managed to elude capture. Police in Britain described it as one of the worst cases of domestic violence they had ever seen. Suzanne suffered horrific burns, and doctors claimed that had McClain proceeded to pour another round of hot water, she probably would have been killed. Later, McClain managed to sneak into her hospital room and threaten her again. He was later arrested afterwards and sentenced to 14 years in jail in 2014. Number 5. Miss McGill. In September 2011, a man named Keith Allen McGill brutally assaulted his unnamed wife. One morning, McGill, who was upset over payment issues, had been breaking things in the house. His distraught wife called a neighbor, who then took her husband to a bar. He came home later crashing through the front door and knocking it off its hinges. His wife, who was still recovering from a recent operation, then became his target. McGill kicked, punched, and stomped her on the back, all done in front of their terrified 10-year-old son. The attack went on and intensified. McGill struck his wife with a lamp that tore her scalp, burnt her with a cigarette, slashed her with a knife, and repeatedly struck her with a belt. At one point, he threatened to kill her and tried yanking her tongue out. Their son ran out to their neighbors for help, who then called 911 when authorities arrived. McGill was fighting with his neighbor, who he had been drinking with earlier. McGill was arrested and his wife taken to the hospital. Doctors reported that she suffered extensive nerve damage, memory loss, and other severe injuries that would likely result in her death after a few weeks. McGill was sentenced to 50 years in jail, and the prosecuting attorney called it the worst domestic assault she had ever seen in her life. His wife did not attend the hearing and had since divorced him and moved out of the country. Number 4. Mary Clemens. For domestic abuse victims, one of the hardest things to do is break the cycle, as most women who leave their abusers tend to return after a while. When the abuser has exerted a large influence and control over their victim's life, the woman might be incapable of supporting themselves and their children once they leave. This happened to Mary Clemens from Michigan, who throughout her 15-year marriage had been constantly abused and held captive against her will. She had been beaten, tied up, and gagged, locked up in a room for long periods, stripped and left naked in the woods, chased with a car, and had knives and guns aimed at her, all done by her husband. Any sane woman would have left the man given the chance, and that's what she did, for a total of 7 times. But she always ended up coming back to her husband, feeling insecure and thinking that her husband deserved another chance. She also had wished for their daughter to grow up in a household with 2 parents. Friends and co-workers recognized the signs of abuse, and with their support, she finally left for an 8th time in 2002, at the age of 33, and this time for good. This case was brought to court, and her husband pleaded guilty. Number 3. Alan Clinch. Most cases of domestic violence involve men abusing women, but it can also go the other way around. Cases where males are the victims instead of perpetrators are in fact quite high, and in 2010, the CDC reported 5 million cases nationwide, with men being victims. In Cornwall, it has been reported that males are more often being victims in the English county. One such case was Alan Clinch, who was stabbed to death by his wife Sandra with a pair of scissors in 2012. The couple was having an argument because Alan had ignored her command to tidy the house, choosing to tend the garden instead. Sandra flew into a rage, and before she knew it, a 4-inch pair of scissors was embedded into her husband's chest, piercing his heart and lung. He died at the scene. Alan happened to be Sandra's 4th husband, and according to her son, she had a history of violence against her former husbands and children, and would occasionally go into a rage. She tried suggesting to the jury that the whole case was nothing but a tragic accident, but the verdict found her guilty of manslaughter. She now serves a 9-year prison sentence. Number 2. Sam Bunarith. Cambodia is a country that sees many cases of acid attacks, usually the result of romantic trysts, personal vendettas, as well as domestic violence. Scores of people use sulfuric acid and other highly potent acids in malicious revenge attacks, leaving their victims permanently disfigured for life, both physically and mentally. Sam Bunarith was a respected man in his community in Cambodia's Persat province. He worked as a regional marketing salesman for Coca-Cola and enjoyed a sizable income, but in an instant, all that was gone. One day, in December 2005, he came home to an angry wife who, angered with her husband's infidelity, decided to pour acid over his face. The acid burned through Sam's skin, and in an attempt to save himself, he ran outside towards a lake nearby. But by the time he reached the water, he was already blinded, and the acid had eaten away his face, destroying his nose and ears. His wife was in prison for the attack, but Sam asked his brother to bail her out. He worried for his children, who he was no longer able to take care of due to his blindness. Sam had lost his job and struggled to find a new one. He even tried to commit suicide twice, but abandoned the attempt after his son discovered him attempting to hang himself in the house and pleaded him to stop. Sam now works as a peer counselor at the Cambodian Acid Survivors Charity Shelter, trying to help others who shared similar fates. Recent studies show that the number of men and women victims of acid attacks in the country are roughly the same, and attack rates have generally increased in the past decade. Number 1. Shahena Udin. Shahena Udin was a teenager from Watford, England, who lived a horrible life with an abusive family. She was subjected to a regime of fear and was often beaten up for trivial things. She was even forced to lick the toilet bowl and eat her own feces, for annoying her relatives by not eating at the speed they wanted her to. In 2014, Shahena's family beat her over a 24-hour period with weapons that included a baseball bat, a mop handle, and a glow stick. The 19-year-old Shahena eventually died from her injuries, and the family mounted a cover-up, hiding her bloodstains and trying to avoid police questions. Neighbors said that the night of the murder, the beating was so loud that they thought the family was tenderizing meat. Police said that the murder was one of the most horrific domestic abuse cases in living memory. Shahena's brothers, as well as her sister-in-law, were all convicted of her murder in 2015 and sentenced to jail.